I would like to welcome you to this class on Francis Schaeffer's book, True Spirituality. If you don't know me already, my name is Dan Gwynn, and I'm the founder and developer of a website called FrancisSchaefferStudies.org, which is a site devoted to the study and research of the works of Dr. Francis Schaeffer and his wife Edith. We founded the site primarily for the purpose of the study and research of the works of Dr. Francis Schaeffer, but also to pass the works of the Schaeffers on to the next generation, to make their thought and teaching more accessible for general inquiry. Teaching classes like this is just one of the ways that we are attempting to do that. And additionally, we are a free resource to the L'Abri and Francis Schaeffer community at large. And we do various forms of research projects, media productions to that end. We also are available, if you'd like to follow us, on Facebook, Twitter, and numerous other social media outlets, and specifically for engaging people in thought around the works of Francis Schaeffer. So find us, follow along, join the Facebook fan page or the Facebook group, and engage with us on these thoughts. So I want to take a moment to share our primary reasons for teaching the works of Francis Schaeffer. And some really may get the wrong idea. We're not doing this to elevate Dr. Schaeffer, but firstly to be biblical. We believe Scripture instructs us to remember our leaders and consider the outcome of their way of life and to imitate their faith. And so that is actually our guiding verse from Hebrews 13:7. Remember your leaders, those who spoke to you the word of God. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. Scripture provides further instruction in this role of imitating their faith, where Paul says in Philippians 3:17, brothers, join in imitating me. Keep your eyes on those who walk according to the example you have in us. And then likewise also, Paul instructs as to why we should imitate him. Be imitators of me, he says, as I am of Christ. Now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I have delivered them to you. And this is a letter to the First Corinthians, or letter to the Corinthians. And his first letter makes this emphasis of commending them for remembering him and for maintaining the traditions that he had delivered to them. So it's very important that we maintain the traditions that have been delivered to us, and we consider the outcome of the way of life of Dr. Francis Schaeffer. Now, Schaeffer is just one of many possible historical figures one might study who have valuable things to say to our culture, to our time. Yet Schaeffer is perhaps unique in that he has, or what he has been saying has so much relevance to learning what is needed to live in a post-Christian culture. I can think of no other figure who consistently puts forward the historic Christian position in such a way that so profoundly speaks to our current situation. Moreover, the majority of those today who are doing so were influenced by him. That is, the majority of those who are in the evangelical world who are speaking to culture, or who are speaking to these things, were influenced by him. Countless ministries have been influenced by his words, and I talked to scholar after scholar who readily admit to me it was Schaeffer's works that first opened their mind to think. And their belief was that they could now think without committing intellectual suicide. One quote which I share quite often, which perhaps sums up the way I think we all need to view Dr. Schaeffer, it states it better than I have heard anyone else say it. He says this: Schaeffer is not an icon to be venerated, but a Christian scholar evangelist of exceptional cloth, from whom we can learn much in our passion to reach the nations for Christ. This comes to us from Dr. Bruce A. Little, the custodian of the Francis Schaeffer collection at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. For those new to Schaeffer's history, I want to give you kind of a brief introduction. And as we will cover this, then we will eventually also get into the book history. So if you're new to Dr. Schaeffer, here's a brief history that will help you understand some of the things about his life and about his history. And I also recommend to you the book by Colin Duryea called Francis Schaeffer, An Authentic Life. And that would be a good place to start if you would like to read something in this regard. So, a brief history. He was first a pastor in the States for over 10 years before he and his wife Edith were called to be missionaries to post-war Europe with the charge to strengthen that which remains. They had previously founded the first summer Bible school program in St. Louis, what we would now call Vacation Bible School. This would later blossom into a ministry called Children for Christ, which was named after a book title by Andrew Murray. And they were active in spreading this ministry of children in war-torn Europe. And they finally would go on to found a ministry called L'Abri Fellowship. And L'Abri is a French word that means the shelter. L'Abri is a community dedicated to providing honest answers to honest questions as a primary tenet of ministry. They were engaging young people. And at a time really during the 60s where people were actively seeking spiritual enlightenment and asking deep philosophical questions, L'Abri became a haven for people to explore these questions of life and the Christian answers in an honest way. People who visited experienced love and hospitality and witnessed a life of prayer that often disarmed them of their perceptions and paved the way for personal spiritual exploration. The Holy Spirit used the work of the Schaeffers to bring thousands to Christ in the deeper spiritual life. And then specifically, these books as well would have great influence, as Dr. Schaeffer later went on to become an international speaker and author, and he is known for also being involved in several significant documentary films. Now, I'd like to first speak to true spirituality. And I want to show you my book. This is my book with the older cover from Tyndale, and it's a little dated now in its look. And then also I wanted to show you this book here. This is kind of a treasured piece for me because it's a hardback book of true spirituality, which you really can't buy right now unless you search for it on someplace like Amazon or something. But these are cherished to me because they mean something to me specifically, and how Dr. Schaeffer's work, True Spirituality, has influenced my life. And the reason really at the core of why we are doing what we're doing at Francis Schaeffer Studies is because of true spirituality. And so I want to make that completely clear. So as we begin the book, it's important to consider its significance in general, as well as the significance of in Dr. Schaeffer's works. But in my opinion, this is perhaps Dr. Schaeffer's most foundational work due to what it means in the big picture of his worldview. The big picture of his worldview. Yet to me personally, it is really the most cherished, as the book literally has changed my life. Every time I teach it, I am thoroughly moved, and my own spirituality is deeply strengthened. And this time, I'm sure, will be no different. In relation to the context of Schaeffer's works, we must recognize that it has a very important place at the center. Many people have formed perceptions about Francis Schaeffer and his thought by not reading him thoroughly. When I interviewed Dr. Calhoun of Covenant Theological Seminary about Schaeffer and asked him how would someone who is new read Dr. Schaeffer? Where should they start with his works? And he recommended something quite unusual. He suggested that a person read True Spirituality and his other book, The God Who Is There, which is really his first work, and it's usually considered more philosophical and really at the core of a lot of the cultural criticism, at least the beginning of that. And he suggests that you read them at the same time. It's been very common to pick up this philosophical or the deep intellectual side of Dr. Schaeffer and yet miss how he addresses true spirituality. Miss how he addresses the nature of our relationship with Christ. And I also feel like another book belongs in this collection, and that is The Mark of a Christian. And I'll talk to you about why here in just a bit. But The Mark of a Christian, showing the proper balance of truth and love, or the proper application holistically, really, of truth and love, that they're not two separate entities, but one entity combined, is essential really to understanding Dr. Schaeffer. So you can't give cultural criticism without understanding Dr. Schaeffer's book on true spirituality, that means that you ought to share truth with love. And so this is so important, and so many have read Dr. Schaeffer and have been inspired by him, but there are also a lot who have forgotten these tenets. This should be at the core of our practice on relating to the lost world. And so I want to emphasize that, and we'll elaborate that on as we go here. I would argue really that if you haven't read True Spirituality, respectfully, you really don't know Schaeffer. If you haven't read and understood True Spirituality, you really don't know Schaeffer. At this point, I have to come clean and admit that this was my personal experience. After going through a nearly lifelong intellectual drought, finally I stumbled upon and was introduced to by a friend, How Shall We Then Live? Dr. Schaeffer's book and film series. It was like I discovered a significant oasis in a parched desert. So while How Shall We Then Live was eye-opening and transformational, my spirituality became rather intellectually driven and imbalanced. I was very bitter at the groups in the church that I had been associated with for ignoring the depth of our faith and concentrating on numerous unprofitable things that were preventing the church and myself from growing. I was angry, and rightfully so, but lacking love and compassion. This carried over into my personal relationships, sadly. It was not until I read Dr. Schaeffer's book, True Spirituality, that I began, by God's grace, to achieve some balance. So this is why I feel very strongly that there is a need to clarify Schaeffer's teaching in both a heartfelt and a mind-felt spirituality. Again, a heartfelt and a mind-felt spirituality. And this is really truly significant in the transformational aspects of what it brings to us. Dr. Schaeffer self-documents. He regularly tells us what the meaning of his works are if we study them. There's specifically things that are found in several articles, and sometimes in the prefaces of books. Sometimes he'll comment on it in the middle of his books in different places. And so he's making these observations. We also have some video where he mentions things about his books, and we'll be showing at least one of those during this class. But it's not just my opinion that true spirituality is central. Dr. Schaeffer begins this book's preface with these important words. This book is being published after a number of others, but in a certain sense, it should have been my first. Without the material in this book, there would be no L'Abri. That's a pretty significant statement. Dr. Schaeffer is saying that his entire ministry would not exist if it were not for the content of this book. So I think it's very important that we take true spirituality seriously as we consider the thought of Francis Schaeffer. Now, history. Let's cover a little bit about the history. How did true spirituality come about? Well, in actuality, the content of the book has its origin before Schaeffer's other works. Although published in 1971, the content of true spirituality began to come about through a spiritual crisis that Schaeffer had in the early 1950s. And so let me read just a couple of quotes from him on this born in crisis notion. In 1951 and 1952, I faced a spiritual crisis in my own life, Dr. Schaeffer says. I had become a Christian from agnosticism many years before. After that, I had become a pastor for 10 years in the States. And then for several years, my wife Edith and I had been working in Europe, And during this time, I felt a strong burden to stand for the historic Christian position and for the purity of the visible church. Gradually, however, a problem came to me, the problem of reality. This had two parts. First, it seemed to me that among many of those who held the orthodox position, one saw little reality in the things that the Bible so clearly says should be the result of Christianity. Second, it gradually grew on me that my own reality was less than it had been in the early days after I had become a Christian. I realized that in honesty, I had to go back and rethink my whole position. So rather significantly, that if you think about what's going on here, Dr. Schaeffer has been a pastor for 10 years. He's been involved in all these different discussions on the Orthodox Christian faith, and realized that, as Paul pointed out in the first lecture, that he had been in this battle. He had been involved in this battle between warring parties, the separatists, who were dealing with all of these things that were creeping in, of the new modernism, as it was called at that time. And so whether it was religious existential thought, or whether it was the new Bartianism or neo-orthodoxy or whatever, it was all these different movements were coming into the church. And Dr. Schaeffer, after 10 years of seeing the warfare going on, not only between those who were the new modernist and the evangelicals, but also the infighting that ensued between the evangelicals, who some were saying, well, you're not reforming enough, and others would say, well, you've reformed too far, and there was this ongoing issue of debate between them, and it became very ugly. And the reality that Dr. Schaeffer began to notice is that the church has lost in this battle its other distinction. They were standing for truth, but in their battle, they lost the other distinction of love. And this is so important for us as we think about this and think about the origins of true spirituality. This is at the central core of Dr. Schaeffer's thought. Truth with love. Now, Dr. Schaeffer says, later on in my ministry, I faced another crisis that equally influenced the writing of my books. It came after I had already been a pastor. And he's talking about the same crisis because the first crisis really that he means in the context of this quote was that originally when he was dealing with the question of belief, and so his agnosticism, which he alluded to in the last quote we read. So he said that this crisis equally influenced the writing of my books. It came after I had already been a pastor for 10 years in the U.S. and a missionary to Europe for 5 years. Throughout this period, one thing was dinned into my thinking. Why, I asked, is there so little reality among Orthodox evangelical Christians? Why is there so little beauty in the way Christians deal with one another? Dr. Schaeffer says, this led to doubts about the reality of spiritual things in my own life. I realized that although I had been studying for years, and although I had been active in Christian ministry, and although I had become more and more known in certain Christian circles, the reality of my own spiritual life was diminished. Somehow I had lost what I had when I had first become a Christian. For about 2 months I walked out in the Swiss mountains. When it rained, I walked in the old hayloft above our chalet. And as I prayed, I went all the way back to my agnosticism, which was with as much honesty as I could. I asked myself, was I right in becoming a Christian as a young man? The unreality I had found in the Christian world, the ugliness I saw in Christian relationships, the fact that Christians were not able to talk to 20th century people, all these things made me ask, was I right? So you see this despair that begins to overwhelm Dr. Schaeffer, this crisis, this feeling that he's buried in. And he begins to withdraw. He begins to study. He begins to walk and think and rethink everything. He doesn't just start just thinking a little bit, he rethinks everything. There are comments in a letter, more specifically on the matters encountered in their movement, the separatism that he was dealing with. He says, "There really are many things about our separatist movement which have made me increasingly unhappy. I do not think our movement is in the place where the Lord can bless it, as its basic principles would seem to indicate. Not that I think our separation is wrong. My time in Europe has convinced me that we are 1,000% right in this, but I do think that certain ones among our men have missed the woods for the trees." So this is so significant. This comes from the letters of Dr. Schaeffer, edited by Lady Dennis. But let's now take a turn and look at how Dr. Schaeffer begins to solve this problem. Sure, the origins were in the difficulties. The origins were in this crisis. But he doesn't just stay there. As he begins to walk and rethink everything and restudy, he stumbles across this wonderful understanding. And this also, too, is in the letters of Francis Schaeffer. And he's writing to a friend on April 14th, 1951, and he says this: "Enclosed is a copy of an article I've just sent to the Sunday School Times. I have been writing it for 2 years. It has meant more to me than any article I have ever written. I do not know if they will print it, but I am sure the Lord has a use for it somewhere. May the Lord bless you. And let us spend a real time in prayer together that the Lord will show the balance between purity and love, which will give us a real joy in our Lord and the power in his service." Now, Schaeffer published 2 articles in that year in the Sunday School Times, and one of them fits the description. It's called "The Secret of the Power of the Enjoyment of the Lord." And I talked about the connection between true spirituality and the mark of a Christian. Well, here in this particular article that Dr. Schaeffer wrote in 1951, we see that it contains the core tenets of both books in seed form. So this is rather significant for us in that we understand that not only is this what Dr. Schaeffer is mentioning in his quotes as being part of the difference, part of the change in reality for him, it is also what we see here finally in this article. The secret of the power and enjoyment of the Lord. And this is actually available for free online if you search for it. And we also have it on our website. And so do a search for it and you will find it, and you'll be able to download a PDF copy of it and be able to read it. And so there is much that we could review in the content of Dr. Schaeffer's letters that would be helpful on this matter. For the sake of time, I'll just say that if you desire to learn more about Dr. Schaeffer's journey in this part, read part 1 of the letters entitled "The Reawakening of Spiritual Reality." There's a lot in there where he is sending letters and talking about these things, and so it will be helpful to then grasp this more deeply if you like. Now, the next development takes place in 1953 and 54. The Schaeffers returned to the U.S. with their family on furlough, and Fran began an extensive speaking and traveling tour. Schaeffer traveled across the country speaking 346 times during 515 days, and sometimes 3 times a day, about the deeper spiritual life. And part of his teaching schedule also included courses at Covenant Theological Seminary, actually teaching those. During this time, Schaeffer's first presented the aforementioned talks, which grew out of his spiritual crisis and later became the basis for true spirituality. Now, as he begins to preach these sermons, they begin to be developed, and they find their way eventually into another book, and at least part of these do, and then finally some of these will become the corpus of true spirituality. So let me explain. So the titles that someone may be familiar with, if you've read the book No Little People, No Little People has the title, The Lord's Work and the Lord's Way. It is difficult to walk through the mud and not get dirty, and later became just the title, Walking Through the Mud. And his classic, Ash Heap Lives, which is both a separate sermon and the book title of the British version of No Little People that would later be printed in the States under that title, No Little People. So these sermons were already in that early corpus of his thought. But then the ones that relate to true spirituality became immediately obvious here. The sermons relating specifically were his illustration of the two chairs, which was an illustration Schaeffer used quite often and shows up in different forms, such as in his third work, Death in the City, as well as true spirituality. Another message that closely related to true spirituality was living in the supernatural now, which is the subject matter of chapter 5, of true spirituality. And yet perhaps the most significant of the talks during this period was the development of a series of talks from a summer Bible camp in Dakota. Now, Schaeffer just used the word Dakota, so we don't know where this is yet. Maybe someone does, and hopefully we'll figure that out in our research at some point. But this camp in Dakota, it's a Bible camp in Dakota. And Schaeffer seemed to have this brainstorm of thought on spirituality. And he stayed up for many hours, night after night, preparing a series of talks, which he called Sanctification 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, which he delivered from July 5th through the 12th in 1953. And actually, during the course of this class that we're teaching, the week of his teaching True Spirituality during the summer months will occur. So it's kind of wonderful. These will be developed into a full corpus, which was finally the true spirituality that we understand. And the study would change everything. And it would begin to develop from there a little bit further. And let me just read from Dr. Schaeffer, where he explains that this next evolution from that place of crisis to this place of his letters and the writing of his work, The Secret of the Power and Enjoyment of the Lord, and finally during this furlough. And then he writes these topics such as the two chairs and also the living in the supernatural now and sanctification 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then finally the final version. This is what he says. These principles, which I worked out in Champery, were first delivered as talks at a Bible camp in an old barn in Dakota. So here's that barn in Dakota again. This was in July of 1953. And we know from elsewhere that is specifically July 5th through the 12th, right after the 4th of July. And incidentally, July 6th was Francis and Edith Schaeffer's anniversary. So it's rather wonderful that this series and this particular mode of thought and understanding on true spirituality occurred so closely acquainted with the specific days of who they are and who they were celebrating the gift of marriage that God had given them. And so there you go. So he says that this was in July of 1953. They were developed on scraps of paper in the pastor's basement. The Lord gave something very special from these messages, and I'm still meeting those who as young people had their thinking and their lives changed there. After L'Abri began in 1955, I preached these same messages in Waymo. Later, they were developed further into a more complete form in Pennsylvania in 1963. I then gave them again in Waymo in the late winter and early spring of 1964. So you have several versions of these as these are developed and finally come into the final form. And this was their final form and the form in which they are recorded on the L'Abri tapes. So do a search for those in the Francis Schaeffer collection on the EDITH'S and it's L'Abri-ideas-library.org, and you can actually listen to those. And the Lord used these tapes and later the book in a way that moved us deeply, not only with those with spiritual problems, but for many who had psychological needs as well. So finally, they go on and they influence the life of L'Abri. So Dr. Schaeffer says, and finally the sun came out. I saw that my earlier decisions to step from agnosticism to Bible-believing Christianity was right, and I also discovered that I had been missing something vital in my biblical understanding. It was this, that the finished work of Christ on the cross, back there in time and space, had a moment-by-moment meaning. Christ meant his promise to be taken literally when he said that he would bear his fruit through us if we allowed him to do so. Not only in our religious life, but in all of our life. Christ meant to be the Lord of my whole life. This brought my life to a great shattering moment. What began as a struggle ended in a song. Without that crisis, I would have never written True Spirituality, for that book is the outcome of that personal struggle. This then was the background when, in 1955, my wife and I began L'Abri in the little town of Weymouth, Switzerland. Edith and I committed ourselves to God with one single aim. It was not an evangelistic work. It was not an evangelistic work we wished to start, nor a young people's work, nor a work for intellectuals, nor an outreach to drug people. It was simply that we offered ourselves to God and asked Him very profoundly if He would use us to demonstrate that He exists in our generation. That's all L'Abri is, and that's the way it began. So let's move forward and talk about the significance and context of his and Edith's works. Where is True Spirituality placed within Dr. Schaeffer's works? And I feel this is very important that we emphasize this and re-emphasize this because Dr. Schaeffer clarifies it, but I want to make sure that we understand as we read Dr. Schaeffer's other works, the place of true spirituality in them. And so now, knowing the history, at this point I would like to turn to the question of the significance of true spirituality in Dr. Schaeffer's works. In order to do this, we need to understand how Schaeffer's works are organized. Schaeffer was not the type of writer to catch a fancy and then move on to something else. His works were no arbitrary arrangement of writings. Rather, he was consistently writing on a central theme through his entire career. But there are a lot of subsets in that main theme. And so the specific theme is the Lordship of Christ in the whole of life. And this emphasis is really on kind of the, if you want to give it a subtitle, the emphasis of the historic Christian position in a post-Christian climate. So this post-Christian world that we're addressing and living with the Lordship of Christ there. And so this very closely relates to the subject matter of true spirituality because that's what he's teaching us to do. And so Schaeffer describes the trilogy as the hub, you'll see from the graphic, and true spirituality is that at the basis of L'Abri, so it belongs in the center. So you might look at true spirituality and L'Abri, the book L'Abri specifically, and as well the demonstration that it represents in the living out of these principles in the daily life. You might look at it as the axle, you might look at it as the axle of the hub of the trilogy. So true spirituality is the basis of L'Abri, and the L'Abri book was written itself 5 years before, and it rested in a box underneath their bed until after Schaeffer's first books were published. So isn't that interesting? So not only did L'Abri exist and come about because of true spirituality, but the writing of L'Abri actually precedes Dr. Schaeffer's works. It sat there for 5 years telling the story, and many of the people who visited were allowed to read it. And one person who was a director for many years, Larry Snyder, came to faith, as I understand it, by reading it. Now, Dr. Schaeffer emphasizes that his works are to be combined with Edith's works. They're connected. And then specifically, the balance of Edith's works provides specific balance on art, beauty, and hospitality. And then there's this connection really at the core. Another work that was from the very beginning and that was growing is the basic Bible studies. And these are a wonderful overview of the Christian worldview, the Christian teachings at their core, providing scripture for each and every one of those core things. And so it's a wonderful connection and foundation. And then also this mark of a Christian one. So let's talk about this. As evangelical Christians, we have tended to relegate art, Dr. Schaeffer says, to the very fringe of life. So he's talking about this, but he also mentioned something very specifically here about the Lordship of Christ. So that's why I'm providing this. So the rest of human life, we feel, is more important. Despite our constant talk about the Lordship of Christ, we have narrowed its scope to a very small area of reality. We have misunderstood the concept of the Lordship of Christ over the whole of life, or the whole of man, and the whole of the universe, and have not taken to us the riches that the Bible gives us for ourselves and for our lives and for our culture. The Lordship of Christ over the whole of life means that there are no Platonic ideas in Christianity, no dichotomy or hierarchy between the body and the soul. God made the body as well as the soul, and redemption is for the whole man. Evangelicals have been legitimately criticized for often being so tremendously interested in seeing souls get saved and go to heaven that they have not cared much about the whole man. So this emphasis, really, the Lordship of Christ. And then now let's talk about the trilogy. I just gave you an overview, so let's go into the specifics. Why is the trilogy what it is? And this is how Dr. Schaeffer describes the trilogy. The basic trilogy has been the God who is there, escape from reason, and he is there and he is not silent. These three books. And then it says, all others fit into these as spokes of the wheel fit into the hub. The early books broke ground in calling for the Lordship of Christ in the arts, literature, cinema, philosophy, and so on. How shall we then live? Whatever happened to the human race in the Christian Manifesto, bring this body of thought forward in the area of Christian's duty under the Lordship of Christ and the whole of life as citizens, especially in the area of law and government, and standing for a high view of human life. And then true spirituality is the basis. We've already emphasized this, but let's go into three quotes that give us a little bit more light from that, from Dr. Schaeffer saying it himself. He says, all of the books are to be read and understood together, along with my wife's EDITH'S books. They together are a unit. So he unites them with EDITH'S works, and true spirituality here is at the core of that and connected with L'Abri. In our ministry, my wife and I consciously tried to balance the intellectual with the spiritual and personal sides. This is seen particularly in L'Abri and true spirituality. Also, the last chapter of Death in the City stresses the reality of the individual and the group relation to God. So this is Dr. Schaeffer in an article, Why and How I Write My Books, from Eternity Magazine, 1973. And then 1974, he says a similar thing in a slightly different, but very similar, updated version of this article called How I Have Come to Write My Books, instead of Why and How I Write My Books. And this is How I Have Come to Write My Books, and it's in the introduction to Francis Schaeffer, a study guide to the trilogy. And he says, EDITH'S book, L'Abri, is a vital element, and without it, the other books lack true unity and balance. Her book shows how acting upon the fact that the infinite personal God is really there has worked out in the day-to-day practice in the community of L'Abri. True spirituality is likewise crucial. It is a systematic treatment of the whole basis of Christian living in an open relationship with God and then with himself and others. So Dr. Schaeffer is explaining these things in this context that we've been talking about. And so as we think about all these things and think about the centrality of this book and the whole of Schaeffer's works, we have a whole new context really to begin to explore his works, a whole new context and foundation that will help us understand them better. So in summary, in this class you will learn that it is not enough to merely be spiritual, whereas many conceive of spirituality as something mystical and far removed from the practical aspects of life. Dr. Schaeffer's book, True Spirituality, on the other hand, points us toward a personal spirituality with the whole Trinity that touches the whole life and stands out as a living, breathing cultural apologetic. I encourage you to learn from this classic work on the living of the Christian life in a post-Christian setting.